Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. As more and more candidates declare that they are running for president in 2020, we are fully now engaged in the electoral season, which raises questions again about the Electoral College, the way we elect President of the United States. My guest on this episode is Robert Hardaway, a professor of law at the Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver, and a critic of reforms, proposed reforms to the Electoral College system, including a pact among certain states to completely disregard the way the Electoral College operates to elect president. This is the time to start to try to understand this issue, and it's a fascinating one. In the 2016 election, when President Trump, now President Trump, won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, many people were clamoring for change. This is the season when those calls are going to become louder and louder. So stay tuned for this very important and fascinating episode. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Electoral College. You know, after the election in 2016 of President Trump, when he won the presidency, having won the Electoral College, but having lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, a lot of people started asking whether it's time to reconsider whether the Electoral College is a good idea. And but by the way, that's not the first time that people have raised this question. But thankfully, we have on the program today an expert, not only in the Electoral College, but a law professor who's been testifying in the Colorado legislature on this issue and is the author of a forthcoming book on this issue entitled "Saving the Electoral College: Why the National Popular Vote Would Undermine Democracy." So I want to first of all welcome Professor Robert Hardaway from the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Professor Hardaway, thank you so much for being on the program.
Well, thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this very topical topic.
It is a topical topic, and it's one that probably we all learned something about in our high school civics class. Hopefully, we learned something about it. But I'll bet most people don't even realize that apart from the chatter, maybe an occasional newspaper editorial after President Trump was elected, that there actually are real discussions taking place in state legislatures, including the Colorado state legislature, as I mentioned. So we have to understand what are the issues and what is really being talked about, and what is the best way to proceed forward. And I know you're going to help us do that.
I will try.
Give us a little background on yourself, Professor Hardaway, as we move into this topic. I know you teach law at the University of Denver, but I know you're also, and I say this meaning to be complimentary, you've been a prolific author, both in law reviews and such, but also books and even some popular books. So it'd be, I think, interesting to hear a little bit about your background.
Well, I am a professor of law here. My specialty is the Electoral College right now. I've written a number of books on it. I first got interested in the Electoral College back when I was in high school, and we had a government class where we would introduce bills and vote on them and so on. And I was on one side of this issue, and a fellow named Al Gore, who later became vice president, was on the other side. So that's how I first got introduced to the topic. And now I pretty much specialize in the Electoral College law and also in this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is the way that it's trying to, that some folks are trying to get to the direct election without going through the constitutional process.
Right. Well, and we're going to talk about it. It's an incredible story that you were high school classmates with Al Gore and actually debated the issue that was his undoing when he ran for president in
Yes.
2000. But in order to understand the questions of how to change or whether we should change the system of voting in national elections that we have currently, we have to understand what is the system we have currently. And I know that people just imagine we go to the polls and we vote, and that's all they really understand for the most part. But there is an elaborate compromise that was worked out at the founding of our country that really defines how we vote today in national elections. So I think it's good if you would set out for us the two components of the vote, the popular vote and this, I think, still strange idea of an electoral college.
Well, yes, and I think the background is very helpful to people in understanding the present system. At the Constitutional Convention, which no one really expected much from it, even George Washington didn't want to attend because he said there's not going to be any prospect of success.
Yeah.
And the main contention was that was in the legislature as to how the legislature should be constructed under the Constitution. The large states naturally thought, well, let's just do it on population. That whatever the population is, you should get so many representatives in Congress based on the population. And the smaller states, Delaware, Rhode Island, said, look, we're not going to join your union unless you give us equal representation in the Congress. And because of this dispute, the nation was pretty much breaking apart at that point. New York and Pennsylvania were forming their own sort of amalgamation later to hope to be a nation. Smaller states were forming amalgamations. And it was so confusing that even King George was told by his advisors that don't worry, they'll be breaking apart very soon and coming back to good old England. And so when they went to the Constitutional Convention and started to write it, they left the contentious issue of how representation in the Congress should be allocated. And they left it till the end, and it looks like they weren't going to reach an agreement. And so it looked like it was on the whole Congress was on the point of dissolution. People were starting to walk home. And then a compromise was suggested. Why don't we do both? Why don't we have one house that is based on population only and another house where every state has equal representation? And the states that refused to participate before now said, well, maybe we could work with that. Maybe we can get together as one nation if we can work that out. And the Electoral College was then based on that guarantee of equal representation of every state in the Senate and representation based on population in the House of Representatives. The two are intertwined. When you hear the phrase "every vote equal," well, if you really believe that, you want to abolish the Senate, and a lot of representatives now and Congresspeople and politicians are suggesting that because the two go together. So that was the compromise that brought the United States into being. Without it, we'd be, I think, probably sort of like South America. We'd have 6 or 7 different nations right now in the North America.
Well, and I was actually amazed to see this. One of the new members of Congress, Ocasio-Cortez from New York, who's getting a lot of attention in the news media, I saw actually proposed exactly what you're saying, that the Senate be abolished.
Oh, yes.
Right. The
Green
issues,
Party, too, back in...
Yeah, the Green Party. Right. Well, and the issues are a little bit different in 2019 than they were in 1789. It isn't just about small states versus large states. Now it's also about more heavily rural states like Nebraska, South Dakota, and more urban states, like California, New York, Pennsylvania, and so on. So and there are racial and minority issues and ethnic issues wrapped up in that, of course, since rural states tend to lower population of minority Americans compared to more. So I think it's become the debate has become informed by a lot of those additional layers to the issue, right?
Well, yes, and we've now talked about the first prong of the grand compromise that brought the United States into being. The second prong, though, is really the one about the Electoral College, because every state was also guaranteed that they would have electors to elect the president based on the number of representatives they had not only in the House but in the Senate. And without that, the small states said, well, you go form your own country. We're not going to participate. And of course, the whole notion of popular election was brought up, and they realized, for reasons that I'll mention a little bit later, why that could never really produce any kind of majority or even a substantial plurality of support for a president. And so they said, we're going to let each state decide how to send their electors. And since 1875, I think Colorado was the last state to finally say, well, we're going to use popular election for the electors. And our whole Constitution is based on that grand compromise with those two prongs. The first prong, equal representation of states in the Senate, and two, electors based on the number of senators and congressmen they have in the Senate.
And so again, in terms of the Electoral College, the idea is to give smaller states or smaller population states, and if not an actual equal stake in the voting process, at least a fairer stake, right? I mean, California still has a tremendous influence in moving up their primary in the 2020 election season. I think they're probably going to have even more influence than they've had before. But large populated states still have a lot more influence. But this is a compromise that gives smaller, less populated states a fairer.
Well, but not just the small states. It was as John F. Kennedy, who was the last one who really saved the Electoral College back in 1956, in sort of the manner of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because a lot of Republican bigwigs like Everett Dirksen wanted to abolish the Electoral College, and John F. Kennedy saved the day virtually single-handedly. And he noted in his speech to the Senate that we have an electoral system, this is quote, which gives both large and small states certain advantages and disadvantages that offset each other. This is the whole notion of balance of power. The small states have a very small advantage in that they get a guarantee of 3 electors because they have 2 in the Senate and a guarantee of 1 in the House. Right. But the big states also have huge advantages. For example, when California allocates 58 electoral votes all to one party, and New York does something very similar, that's a huge weight that is given to the large states. And as Kennedy noted, these are offset. This is a very, very well thought out balance by the founding fathers.
Well, and so we know that in this most recent presidential election, there were cries that the Electoral College was dysfunctional, and we mentioned Al Gore earlier. The same thing happened in 2000, where by a smaller margin, George Bush lost the popular vote nationally, but won ultimately Florida, and that was the Electoral College, right?
Well, of all the institutions in government, the Electoral College is probably the most functional. Yes, an average of once every 100 years or so, the so-called popular vote, because there's never been an official count of the popular vote. The newspapers do that, and they disagree. In 1960, for example, some newspapers said that Nixon had won the popular vote. Others said that Kennedy had won the popular vote, because there's lots of different ways of counting. For example, how do you count popular votes for unpledged electors? How do you count the popular votes? Well, there's different ways of doing it. And so it's just the newspapers and the media and TV that supposedly come up with this popular vote. It doesn't exist officially at all. Now, occasionally, sometimes, 3 times in the last 200 or so years, the so-called popular vote that the media comes up with might differ from the electoral vote. That happens in any parliamentary democracy. In 1974, for example, in England, Labour had a majority of members of the parliament elected, but they didn't win the so-called popular vote. And no one said, well, they're the wrong prime minister or anything of that sort. So this can happen. There's really been no established way to count the popular votes. We leave it up to the newspapers, and we don't care what the newspapers say because they're not official.
Well, I'm not sure I'm following that, because doesn't each state arrive ultimately at an official popular vote tally for that state?
Well, yes, and this is the big misconception, because NPVIC, which we'll be talking about soon, says, Well, you don't need an official to count the popular votes. You just get the popular votes that come from each state. You go down to the drugstore, you buy a calculator, and then you add them up. And what I was trying to explain is, no, that's not the way you can do it. Because how do you count, for example, the popular votes for unpledged electors? In 1960, several states had ballots, a Democratic ballot and a Republican one. The Democratic one had some that were pledged to Kennedy and some who said, we're not going to pledge. And when they went to the Electoral College, they voted for Byrd. Now, some newspapers said, we'll count the popular votes that were cast for the unpledged electors to Kennedy. And they got their calculators and calculated that Kennedy had won the national popular vote. Other newspapers, like the New York Times and the Congressional Quarterly, begged to differ. And they said, no, the popular votes for the unpledged electors who ultimately went to the Electoral College and voted for Byrd should not be counted as popular votes for Kennedy. The problem is there is no official national popular vote. This is done by Fox News, CBS, MSNBC. There is no official popular vote ever that has been conducted.
Interesting. Okay. Well, so what we have currently then to win the presidency with combining these two methods of voting, people voting individually for a candidate, and then also each state's electoral or each state's electors then voting in this electoral college vote. Currently, the system in all but two states, I think, is that whichever candidate wins the popular vote in that state wins all the electors of that state, meaning a winner take all approach. So Colorado, whoever, in 2016, if it's Trump or if it's Clinton, who wins the most votes in Colorado, that candidate gets all of Colorado's electoral votes.
Well, it's a little different than that. It's a little different than that. When you go to vote in the voting booth, you don't vote for Kennedy or Obama or Trump. You vote for a guy named Joe Blow, who's an elector. And that elector has said, if you vote for me, when I go to the Electoral College, I will vote for this person. And I pledge to vote for Obama. So you never vote for the actual candidate. You vote for the person who is going to go to the Electoral College. And under the present system, some states don't even require the electors to vote for the person they're pledged to. At least they have no sanction. About half the states don't even have sanctions for electors who violate their pledge. So you don't vote for a candidate.
Has that ever happened, that the electors go against the pledge they make as to
It's happened 6 times in American history. In 1948, an elector that said he promised to vote for Truman went there and he voted for somebody else. So it's never affected an election. Colorado has a law now that says that it's criminal. You can't violate your pledge, but not all states do that.
Okay. Well, so there is this intermediate step, I understand, that where you're voting for an elector, but I mean, could that be changed? I mean, or is that just
of course it could be changed because every state. Let me give you a little background of what the Constitution says on this point. It says that each state can decide how they select their electors. And early in American history, the legislatures of the states would select the electors. But by 1875, Colorado was the last state to say, no, we'll let the people determine who the electors are. So now the electors are chosen by popular vote of the state, of each state. And they're elected based on their pledges. And states like Colorado say you have to vote for the person you're pledged to. But not all states do that. It's up to each state to determine how they want to do it.
Yet it does seem, when I went into the voting booth the last time, I don't remember Joe Blow's name. I was pulling a vote for one of the two major candidates. So
well, you have to read the fine print. It'll say in most states, in very fine print, it will say you're voting for Joe Blow, and then in big letters it'll say Obama. Okay, so you
Right.
think you're voting for Obama. Now, some states have even left out the small print to give you the illusion that you're actually voting for a candidate. But most states actually have the name of Mr. Joe Blow down there, and
Hmm.
you're voting for Joe Blow, who has promised that if you elect him, he will go to the Electoral College. And it's very rare that they violate their pledges. Two, two, um, two electors in this last election in Colorado did try to violate their pledges, and that's a whole different topic. We'll tell you because that's before the 10th Circuit or not, because
Hmm.
Colorado said you can't do that, and they said yes we can, and so the Attorney General asked me to write an amicus brief to establish that states have the power under Article 2 to enforce laws requiring electors to vote for the person that they pledged to vote for.
Wow. Okay. Well, so, and you mentioned this earlier that the 2016 election wasn't the first time that we had this discrepancy between the winner of the Electoral College and the winner of the so-called, I'll put it in quotes here, the
Well,
so-called
the first time was
popular
in the
vote.
1888 election where that happened, yes. The second time was in the 1960 election, where most newspapers in the Congressional Quarterly said that Nixon had won the popular vote, and that Kennedy had lost the popular vote, but won in the Electoral College.
Yeah.
That was the second time, and the third time was in 2000, and the fourth time was in 2016. So I said three, but in this century, but four overall in the history of the United States,
All right.
which
So,
happens in any parliamentary democracy. Yes.
all right. So it has been relatively rare in American history, but two of the last three presidents, you could say, were elected with this, where this issue came up. So and
Well,
then I,
except that we can't really know, except for the
yeah,
fact that we can't really know what the popular vote was because we have no official tally of the popular vote. We have media getting
unofficial.
out their
Yeah.
calculators.
Okay. All right. Then I understand what you mean by that. But so
Okay.
let's then look at two separate but related questions, which is, first of all, should we abandon the Electoral College in favor of a system that is more directly linked to the popular vote, have voters directly vote for candidates and directly elect a candidate to be president is sort of one big question. And then there's this other related question, which you mentioned, which is this national popular vote interstate compact, which is an actual
Okay.
real thing that we're going to have to understand. And I was pretty astonished
Right.
to learn about it. And that's
Well, let's
one
take the first.
version of how we do that. Okay.
Yes, let's take the first one first. Should we abolish the Electoral College?
Yeah.
Well, we could if we got every state to agree, because the Electoral College allocation of electoral votes is based on equal state suffrage in the Senate. And Article 5 of the Constitution says that's the one provision in the entire Constitution that cannot be amended by regular constitutional amendment, two-thirds of Congress, three-quarters of the states, that every state has to agree to give up their equal suffrage in the Senate, which in turn the Electoral College allocation of electoral votes is based. So it could be done. And then the question is, well, it could be done if every state agrees, but let's assume that every state did agree. Would it be a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the direct election notion was considered by the constitutional founding fathers, and they rejected it for very good reason because it doesn't produce a majority president. I call this the Russian style election. They used it in France in 2017, direct election. And they had 4 or 5 parties, including the 2 major parties. And an extreme right winger got 21% of the vote. An unknown maverick got 23%, nudging out the majority parties, the 2 main parties. And so there was a runoff between the right-wing extremist who got 21%, the maverick who got 23%, and the voters were told you have to choose between these two in a runoff. And the voters in France were so outraged by this Russian-style direct election that 600,000 of them cast blank ballots, the ballot blank, saying this is not democracy. 2/3 of the electorate oppose these two, and yet that's what was elected of somebody who got 23% in the original round. So it doesn't produce majority presidents. It's not democratic. It's basically the Russian system, which has worked in similarly bad fashion there. In fact, we only have to look at who's the president there to realize how badly it works. But
All
that's
right,
what some people would like to do.
all right. Well, so let's. I understand completely the point you're making about Article 5. That this grand compromise was really became part of the Constitution in the form really of a guarantee to all of these states that that was how the bargain was going to be handled. That the you'd have equal representation in the Senate, and the corollary to that would be equal representation in the Electoral College. Um, but let's just put that aside for a moment and understand some of the other arguments. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand what you're saying about a non-majority candidate. Is the at least possible result of having a candidates elected through a popular vote approach. But on the other hand, Professor Hardaway, I mean, we have a system where, in effect, it's really difficult, if not impossible, for a third party or a fourth party candidate to compete because of the dominance of the two major parties. So, if an outside party or this maverick candidate, I assume you're referring to President Macron now,
Right.
who ultimately won in France, uh, comes in with enough support, yeah, that might displace the one of the two major party candidates. But where is it written that we should only have two dominant parties to choose from?
Well, it's not. And in fact, if one party can really be a party and establish itself, like the Republicans did in 1860, and they replaced the Whigs. Also, if you look at the election in 1992 in the United States, 3 months before the election, 4 months before the election, Perot had 33%, Clinton had 22%, and Bush had 24%. If the election had been held then, the Democratic Party would have been consigned to the dustbin of history, all right? And so there would have been just Perot versus Bush. And Perot, of course, had no national party behind him. He might have been able to create one, but this is why the Congresses over the last 50 to 100 years, every time someone comes in saying every vote equal and so forth, that's why Congress, when they realized that it would abolish the two-party system, that you would have 5, 6, 7 candidates, you'd have a runoff between two people that 2/3 of the people oppose, that you're not going to get a candidate that has support across the country. One of the reasons for having the Electoral College was the notion of the drafters that support for a candidate should not just be overwhelming in one area of the country, but all across the entire country. For example, in the 1950s, you had maybe 90% support for segregation. And if 90% of the people in the South vote for a segregationist candidate, they might eke out a national popular vote victory, even though the other 3 regions of the country would oppose it.
Yeah.
The idea is that of the Electoral College is to assure the balance. As John F. Kennedy said in 1956, it is to balance the regions as well. It's not just population, it's areas of the country. And support for a candidate must be broad as well as just deep in one particular region, whether it's cities on the coast or whether it's one region, separate region of the country. Okay.
Well, it does, and it does sort of challenge the notion of what it means to have broad support or to be majority support, because I mean, when you look at the map, the electoral map now in terms of red states and blue states, rural states versus populous or urban states, um, one of the criticisms of an electoral college system is that you have uh, and some fair amount of consistency election to election, let's say in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, a very small number of swing states that are neither reliably blue or reliably red states, but are purple or in the middle or swing, could go either
Mm-hmm.
way. And those are the states that get all the attention from the candidates. Those are the states that get all the attention in terms of advertising dollars that are spent. That means a lot more information, maybe a lot more misinformation, but certainly a lot more attention in some pretty important ways. And those very few states then become, in effect, the deciders of the outcome of the election. And states like California, which
Mm-hmm.
also suffers from being in an earlier time zone, you start to have networks, leaning on who they think the winner is going to be before the polls have even closed in the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Well, you know,
that might discourage people from voting.
well, if we had a national popular vote, every state agreed and so forth and so on,
Yeah.
then you would have a much worse situation with regard to campaigning because the campaigners would completely desert the smaller states, whether they're going to go one way or the other or not. You would go
Right.
to where the votes are.
Yep.
You would go to Los Angeles. You would go to New York City. You would go to Chicago because that's where all the votes are congregated.
Yep.
The rest of the country would be left out in the cold. This way, because South Dakota has a little bit of advantage, they have an extra electoral vote. That's one of the things that was given to them by the founders. So they have a little extra weight, and that's why some of them can get attention that they wouldn't otherwise get. And since we get most of our news from our campaigning information from the candidates over television now, nationwide television, I don't think that if you're in a state which is solidly, for example, in California, none of the parties campaigned there, and so California was mercifully spared all these horrible commercials that flooded the air. I don't know that that's a disadvantage in particular.
Right.
But if you're at a battleground state, then you do have the misfortune of having the airwaves saturated with these commercials. So, but it would be 10 times worse under a national popular vote if the concern is, candidates will only campaign in a part of the country. They will go to what the votes were. It's like the bank robber who was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. Well, if we had a national popular vote system, the campaigners would go to the big cities and populated areas because that's where the votes are.
Well, and we see this on the state level. I'm in Pennsylvania. I live outside of Philadelphia. My office is in downtown. And there is a big difference in terms of the political demographics of Pennsylvania between Philadelphia on the southeastern end of the state and Pittsburgh on the western end of the state, and pretty much everything else in the middle. So if you were running for statewide office in Pennsylvania and you could get a big advantage and a big turnout of votes in, say, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, it's okay if you lose almost every other county in the state because that's not where the population is. And I think that on a small scale is what would happen across the country if we switch to a popular.
Oh, it certainly would. We would have candidates only campaigning in states where there was a big population. And also, you mentioned this other argument I've heard as well, which is that if you're in a state like California and New York, you're not going to go to the polls supposedly because your party's either going to be guaranteed to win or lose. So why should you vote? Well, on a national popular vote, if that's what you had, you could use the same argument that nobody would go to the polls if one party was 10 points ahead in the polls nationwide. Why should I go? We're going to lose anyway. That argument is actually nonsensical when you think about it.
Okay, so let's talk about then, because this so far has been, the theoretical points in favor or not in favor of switching to a nationwide popular vote. But there actually is this initiative, again, that I was really surprised to know even existed, called the National.
Well, that's the problem.
Well, right, it is a problem, and we're going to try.
Nobody's heard of it.
We're going to do our part to fix that. But this,
yes, it is a supposed agreement, proposed agreement between states to circumvent the Constitution. And the idea is that states will get together and say, we don't care what our voters and our states want. We're going to look at what the newspapers say is a popular vote as counted in other states and force our people to vote for them. So let me give you an example. Let's say we had an MPVIC in Colorado in 2020, and it's Trump against, I don't know.
I just want to make sure.
Trump.
This abbreviation here, I just want to make sure we say again what that is. The National Popular Vote.
It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Okay. And according to states, it's kind of a cabal. States that sign on to it agree that we will ignore the votes of our citizens, and we will instead look to Fox News or CBS News, see what they calculate as a national popular vote. We've talked about that before. There is no official vote. There's no entity charged with counting the national popular vote. And we will simply vote the way they say we should vote based on their little calculators. That's the nature of this compact, okay?
Okay.
Now let's see how it might play out. Let's say in 2020, it's Bush. Let's say Trump against, let's say, Obama, even though he's not running, just to give you two big names. And the voters of California, or let's say Colorado, vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate, okay? But the newspapers, Fox News, CBS says, well, it's a close call, but we've calculated that Trump got a small marginal victory in the popular vote. Other newspapers say no, it's Obama got it. So if the voters in Colorado or if the legislature says, well, we like Fox News, we're going to not cast our votes based on the will of the people of Colorado, but we're going to do it on the basis of the so-called popular votes in other states that we have nothing to do with. Now, you can imagine the outrage, especially if by allocating the electoral votes to Trump, Trump wins the election. You can imagine the outraged voters of Colorado saying, what on earth? We voted for Obama. And they say, yes, but we formed this cabal. You've never heard about it, but we have to vote for Trump. And we have to say, you, the voters of Colorado, we have to allocate your electoral votes, the electors that you chose. They have to vote for Trump. And what would happen then? What would happen then is that people like me who are outraged would then go to court and say, we want to get out of this cabal because this is terribly undemocratic and horrible. And then the other side would say, no, you can't get out because the compact says it's sort of like any kind of cabal. Once you're in it, you can't get out. And that's a violation of the compact clause of the Constitution, by the way.
All right,
but that's what they say.
All right, well, let's take a few steps back here. Now, I know you call it a cabal because you're strongly opposed this.
Well, no, a cabal can be good or bad. It's just it's an agreement between parties. That's what a cabal is. It can be for good or bad.
Cabal, I think it has a negative connotation to it, but that's okay. I wouldn't want to be part of a cabal. Let's put it that way. But it is a compact, and this is an important word. Let's make sure we understand this. First of all, and this is a real thing, by the way. There are already 11 states that have signed on to this interstate compact, what you're calling a cabal, including Maryland, New Jersey. Note these are all so-called blue states, by the way. Maryland, New Jersey, Illinois, Hawaii, Washington, Massachusetts, D.C., Vermont, California, Rhode Island, New York, and Connecticut have all passed laws through their legislatures and had that signed by their governor, passed into law to join this interstate compact. This is a real thing already. And as I understand it, in order for it to go into effect, there would have to be enough additional states joining it so that the total electoral votes of the signers on to this compact equal or exceed 270.
Correct.
And why is how does that get even decided? Why? How do we come up with that number?
Well, because that's the number you need. You need X number of votes to have a majority in the Electoral College. That's why. So and if you don't get a majority, then it goes into the House.
So in other words, what they're really saying is that this agreement or this interstate compact goes into effect as soon as there are enough states to control
Right. They
the
leave everybody else out. So that's why I call it cabal. It's not
yeah,
every state. It's just the states that want to sign on to it.
right.
And the reason that they're doing it this way rather than through the constitutional process, which I would not have a big problem with, go to Congress. The NPVIC supporters, supported by these financial groups, and mainly in California and Florida, the reason they want to do it is because every time they go to Congress, the fallacies of it are exposed. So they want to do it under the radar. And they could go to these state legislatures. And the last time I went back in 2007, the last time they tried this to get it passed through, there's only 5 or 6 of us there. And so they try to get it passed under the radar, because if you go to Congress and try to pass a constitutional amendment, you will get public scrutiny. They want to avoid that. And if you don't think that if you think they're getting scrutiny now by going to the legislatures, just go out in the street and ask somebody, you know what MPVIC is? Duh, no. They don't know. It's under the radar, and that's why they're doing it this way.
Well,
and they've been successful.
As I understand it, Professor Hardaway, you just testified this week in the Colorado Senate. Tell us about that, because, again, this is not just a theoretical undertaking. This is an actual undertaking with 11 states already signed on. I believe they are roughly 63.7%.
About 62% there.
Yeah, so
about 2/3 there.
They need a few more states, and I know some commentators like Nate Silver have said this compact will never get to 270 without including some number of battleground or swing states. And for purely political reasons, a swing state may not be willing to give up the special influence they have in all the attention they get from the candidates and from the dollar. So some people have said it's unlikely that any swing state would ultimately want to join into this, but they're not at the very beginning. They're about 62%, 63% of the way there, and Colorado is one of the states that hasn't yet decided. So you were there this week to offer your background expertise and testimony. Just tell us a little bit about what happened there so we understand.
Well, these MPV people, they're financially supported. Of course, I am not supported, and people who oppose it are not supported in any way. We have to get there, but we can't get to all these places. And they are highly financed. The lobbyists come to support this MPVIC. What happened was, this was the 3rd time they've tried it. They tried it back in 2007. And once there was 10-1 in favor of it, and then they let me testify, not for 3 minutes like they did yesterday, because we had 200 people there. And I went into all the things I'm discussing here, and they were appalled, and they voted 10-1 against it. But what usually happens is this is under the radar. Now, the 100 or probably 200 people there. And I was lucky they put me on as one of the first 5 speakers, but they limited this to 3 minutes. So what I'm trying to explain to you in maybe an hour, I had to do in 3 minutes. And what I found out was that nobody was really interested in the Constitution per se or the history or anything. What they were interested in, mostly of these 200 people, was, well, Trump won, so it must be bad. There must be something wrong with the Constitution. And that was their whole, they would get up and testify and say, it's just outrageous. Trump won, and if we had had a national popular vote, he wouldn't have won. So we need to get rid of the constitutional provisions. That was the flavor of it. I was the only one who talked about the fallacies of MPVIC, that it assumes that we would maintain our 2-party system, that it assumes that we would continue to have 2 major parties, rather than being stuck with somebody who's only supported by 21%, as happened in France in 2017.
And okay, so I understand your objections to this particular variation on how to solve, if indeed there is something that needs to be solved, some of the issues that have people unhappy. I think you're right. I think people may be looking at the Electoral College because of the outcome of the last election, but it's not, as we've talked about, it's not the first time this conversation's come up. And we, as a country, as a nation, we have been dealing with these tensions between the ways in which we are a federal republic, we are one nation, and the way we are a confederation of individual states. And
exactly
right. And it takes different shape today, perhaps, than in some of the specifics compared 200 plus years ago. But in some ways, these debates and these tensions have been present throughout our country's history.
Well, they started at the Constitutional Convention. There was a guy named Rufus, a real loudmouth, who said, "Oh, popular vote." And they considered it very diligently and then realized that it would produce not broad support for a candidate, and they finally rejected it. It comes up about every 20 years through some scheme or other to circumvent the Constitution. And you're quite right that it's based today, the arguments are pretty much political. After the 1960 election, it was Republicans who were outraged that Nixon had won the popular vote, according to the New York Times and the Congressional Quarterly, but that Kennedy had won in the Electoral College. And so they were the ones who, for many years, tried to abolish the Electoral College because they didn't like the outcome of that election. Right. Now we're seeing the reverse effect. People are outraged that their candidate didn't win, and so they want to blame the Electoral College.
Well,
so you're quite right. The arguments are based on politics today.
All right. So, but
who won the last election?
But there are, even if you put aside politics, if you put aside who's making the argument, is it coming from a Democrat who's unhappy about Trump, or is it a Republican who's unhappy about Nixon or Kennedy? There are these ways in which, as you quoted JFK saying 50, 60 years ago, there are ways in which big states benefit and ways in which small states benefit. There are ways in which urban, highly populated states benefit, and there are ways in which there are set-offs to balance that in favor of some smaller rural states. The balance may not always be perfect. The balance may lead to one of those interests feeling slighted in the way a particular election goes. But
exactly.
But in the end, as you said, whether you're unhappy with the outcome really depends on whether you won or lost ultimately. But are there
that's
things,
what
are there things that if not abandoning the Electoral College, if not going to a direct popular vote, are there ways in which some of the issues that people are frustrated with, no matter what political party you're a member of currently, are there things that you can see being reformed in terms of the way our national elections are run that would address some of those issues?
Well, we've been going through a process of reform for over 200 years, primarily in the primary system. It used to be it was done by just delegates. Now it's done by popular vote. It used to be that electors were chosen by the legislatures. That's been reformed. There are many reforms that could and should be done, and I've written several books on the reforms that could be done. The one thing that should not be changed is the allocation under the Constitution to states to choose their electors based on popular vote within their states. That's something that John F. Kennedy. Well, let me just quote from him about all these schemes. He said, today we have an electoral system which gives both large and small states certain advantages and disadvantages that offset each other. Now it is proposed that we change all this after 200 years of evolution and fine-tuning our system for an unknown, untried, but obviously precarious system which was abandoned in this country long ago, which previous Congresses have soundly rejected, and which have been thoroughly discredited in Europe. I'm glad you didn't get to see with the fiasco in France. There's obviously, this is continuing the quote, little to gain, but much to lose by tampering with our Constitution in this way.
Well,
so much has been done and is continuing to be done. But going to the Russian system is not a good reform, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. It's disastrous.
Well, the French, you could even call it the French system now, based on what happened.
But it's also the Russian system.
All right,
that's how they came within a whisker of being given a choice between a hardline fascist and a hardline communist that was opposed by 2/3 of the people. And they came within 2 points of being presented with that option under their quote direct election. So I call it the Russian system, which has been a fiasco in every country that has tried it, and that's what JFK was talking to when he said it's been discredited in other countries.
Well, Professor, I have to ask you this, something we started on as we're wrapping up here. I mentioned that you were a high school classmate with Al Gore, and of course,
yes.
Al Gore, as presidential candidate in 2000, won the so-called national popular vote by about a 500,000 votes, but lost in the Electoral
Mhm.
College. What do you remember? What a high school student Al Gore's position was in that high school debate in your civics class?
Well, I'm trying to remember if he was the liberal leader. I know he was. We had two parties, the conservative and liberal
Yeah.
parties, which are a misnomer, and I argued against those two terms. I think they're ridiculous terms. But he was, I know, one of the foremost members of that party. We would meet on Thursday evenings, St. Albans School in Washington D.C. on Thursday evenings, and many of the students there had parents who were members of Congress. They would give us a talk on one issue or another, and we
Hmm.
would propose something. Like I think it was the Liberal Party that supported the abolishing the Electoral College, and then we would debate it, and then we'd have a vote. And I'm trying to remember what the vote was exactly, but it seems to me I think we won based on our arguments. But I won't swear to that since I didn't write it down, and it was about 50 years ago.
Well, and now you have a book. Now you have a book on this, and I want to just give you a chance to tell people again the name of that, because I know it isn't out yet, but it's coming out, and I think this is as we enter another election cycle, and candidates announcing that they're running for president in 2020. I expect that there's going to be a renewed focus on this issue, particularly since Trump looks like he's running for reelection. So this is something that, as we said at the beginning, is a very topical topic, and the timing of your book is also very good.
Well, as far as I know, it's the only book on NPVIC. They have a book called Every Vote Equal, which on its face would imply that we should abolish the U.S. Senate. If you want every vote equal, then that's the first step. The second
yeah.
step would be abolishing the Electoral College that's tied to it. Anyway, I appreciate that. It is in publication with a company called ABC Clio. It's a big conglomerate publishing company based in Santa Barbara, California. It's in publication now. I'm hoping that it'll be out soon. It's called Saving the Electoral College: Why the National Popular Vote Would Undermine Democracy. And as far as I know, it's the only book now that around which actually tries to talk about this MPVIC and the disastrous events that would occur because of that if this cabal ever actually gets formed.
Well, and I'll get this from you later once we're done, but I'll get a link from you to perhaps to the publisher, so that as people listen to this episode and read the description that we'll post online, they can follow the link and pre-order or get a copy of the book if they want to hear more. Professor,
that would be great. I can assure you that all the proceeds go to my research assistants who do the research behind it, which enable me to write these books in the first place.
And I've read, thanks to you sending it to me, I've read the opening section of the book, and it's really great. And I think people need to understand this. I appreciate that I've had a chance to understand something as important as how we vote in this country, to understand the issues a lot better, and I appreciate that very much. So I want to thank you, Professor Hardaway from the University of Denver, Sturm College of Law in Denver, Colorado, professor of law and author of the forthcoming book on the Electoral College called Saving the Electoral College. Thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I appreciate it.